Okay, well, I think I'll start making the assumption that we're live. I can see that we've got over 130 participants. So good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to what we've nattily titled the West End Debate, the Evolution of the Oxford Street District. This is a seminar that's effectively promoted and sponsored by the WPA and New West End Company. So thank you on behalf of both organisations for putting the seminar on today. I'd like to welcome three very important members of the panel for today's session. We have, in no order of priority, Katherine Russell, who's Head of Real Estate Planning, Policy and Commercial at John Lewis. Hopefully I got that right, Katherine. I'd like to welcome Stuart Love, who is, of course, Chief Executive of Westminster City Council. Hi, Stuart. And then finally, Mark Wilde, who is Chief Executive of Crossrail. On behalf of myself and my fellow panelists, I'm great to have you as an audience today. I believe we've got around 45 minutes scheduled for this webinar. I've been asked just to say a couple of thoughts at the beginning and then to pose questions of our fellow panelists, and then we can have a nice debate, and then be delighted to take questions from the audience. So I'd really encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions as we go, and we can store those up and then answer them through the session. So I thought I would just start by, I suppose, making an observation as to where we are. From my perspective, I'm as I think the title says, I'm a member of both the WPA board and New West End Company, and I'm also responsible for the Crown Estates holdings in central London. So clearly any activity in the core West End is absolutely core to our business, and also the member organisations that I'm here representing today. Who would have thought when we had our last WPA NWEC seminar several months ago that I was involved in, that we would be sitting here in this form today. I think C19 has clearly changed a number of things, probably forever. And I think with that in mind, when we contemplate the proposals and plans both for the Oxford Street District, the infrastructure that should form part of that, and in Katherine's perspective, one of the key occupiers on the street, my view is that and now is our moment to contemplate things in a way that we wouldn't have done probably previously. I think while C19, I think we'd all recognise has been hugely challenging, both for people personally, but also from a business perspective. We must take advantage of this shock to the system to, in my world, think the unthinkable, ensure what we do now stands the test of time and really delivers for the West End and for London, and that we take the opportunity to deliver radical change in this fundamentally important global city. So with that in mind, I thought I would start with a couple of questions. Stuart, if it's all right, I'll turn to you first. Firstly, I just wanted to say on behalf of myself, the member organisations I represent, I'd like to say thank you to you, firstly, for obviously attending the panel session, but I think particularly for your willingness to have open, sometimes challenging conversations in an entirely transparent and positive manner, and in your role as Chief Executive of Westminster City Council, that is so important, but also greatly appreciated. So I wanted to make sure I got that point across. And now that I've softened you up with a positive, I can ask you a question. So I suppose, knowing what we where we rest now and the impact of C19 particularly. Would you mind updating the audience as to how Westminster are describing your approach to the Oxford Street district, and perhaps in particular touch upon the level of ambition within your organisation, and if the opportunity arises, perhaps indicate to our audience in the very near term what we can expect to see in some of our core areas and how your longer term thinking is shaping up. Over to you, Stuart.
Brilliant, thanks, James. And I really appreciate what you said about challenge and transparency, because that is the only way we can interact and engage with all of you. And thank you very much for inviting me along this afternoon. I actually just want to go back to a pre-coronavirus, when the new leader of the council, Rachel Robotham, was elected. And the first conversation Rachel had with me about Oxford Street and the Oxford Street district was really saying to me, we need to significantly up our ambition. And that was music to my ears. It is something that I believe the City Council had lost sight of, the importance of Oxford Street and the district and the West End on a global stage. So we have been doing a huge amount of work since the new leader came in around that level of ambition and around our collective vision for the district. And I guess from that point of view, coronavirus hasn't changed anything. Our ambition and what we would like to achieve in the district is really around having that global mindset, around understanding that what we do in Oxford Street district will impact on the rest of the world, and the rest of the world will sit up and take notice. And with that comes an enormous responsibility on the City Council and on all of us to do something there that does, I think, James, you used the phrase, stand the test of time. And whilst I completely agree with that, I think from our point of view, what it also has to do is be flexible enough to change, to grow, to improve, so that we don't end up back in this position in 10, 20 years' time. And there's all sorts of things in there around planning, licensing, etc., alongside the physical interventions we intend making. So we have, during the period of coronavirus, during lockdown, we've actually been doing a fair amount of work, as I've said, around the vision. We've engaged a number of people I know who will be on this call in assisting us with that. And we are in the process now of establishing some governance, which includes stakeholders, so that we can start not just looking at the ambition, which needs to frame everything that we're doing, but also then start moving towards something much more specific in terms of delivery, when we can expect to start seeing some actual physical interventions. A very big and important part of that is our relationship with stakeholders, and the TfL as part of the GLA family, and the mayor in particular, hugely important to us. Yes. And that is an area where, unfortunately, meetings were being arranged, and then coronavirus hit, the mayoral elections being pushed back. So we are looking at how we can rearrange that and make sure that the political relationship between the leader and the mayor is established alongside we do have good working relationships with the GLA and TfL at office level. So that's critically important. They are obviously a critically important stakeholder to us. You asked about some of the short-term interventions. Yes. And I appreciate, because a number of people have said to me that there's a perception at the moment that Westminster is a little bit behind the game in terms of our response. I wanted to say to you and to try and reassure you that we are not. We are looking at this in 3 different areas. The first one is the immediate easing of lockdown and our response to that, working in particular with businesses around things like what we do with pedestrians, cycling, etc. And we are working on over 500 different locations in the city where we've had requests, a lot from business, but also from amenity societies, from our own members, etc., to make physical interventions. So to take out lanes of traffic, etc. We've been working with TfL on that because a lot of this impacts on bus lanes, bus lay-bys, taxi ranks, etc. We will today make some specific announcements about where those interventions will be what will happen from the 1st of June to support, in particular, retail and office coming back, and then what will happen probably in 2 weeks following that to support the hospitality industry coming back. So I appreciate that we haven't said a huge amount, and partly that's because we've been working through this very large number of requests we've had. We will be doing things across the entire city, but we will also, very importantly, be doing some things in some important iconic locations like Regent Street, Oxford Street, Piccadilly Circus area. So all of that will be announced today with the detail that sits behind that. So hopefully that will give some reassurance. We have been doing a lot of work, but I appreciate we should probably have been saying more about that, but we will today set that out in a lot more detail.
Great, thank you, Stuart. Well, I'll come back to you. I've got a couple more questions, but that's a great introduction. Thank you very much. Katherine, I'm going to save you till last if that's okay, because I think it's really important to get John Lewis's perspective as a key business on the street. So if I may, I'm going to turn to you now, Mark. I've attended, you've very kindly come to NWEC board meetings and give us an update on the huge project that is Crossrail and the work that you and your team are delivering. Obviously, there's been a sort of a partial slowdown over the most recent period, but that's a very near-term pause. Would you be kind enough to give us an update on timing and activity from a Crossrail perspective?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to come on the panel, much appreciated to participate. COVID isn't good news for Crossrail. You know, the effect of a global pandemic to have social distancing principles on a major program like this is going to be challenging. But because of where we were with Crossrail in the program at the very end, really, and in the final system integration and assurance work, we already had 80% of our workforce working off-site. So in a funny way, we've managed to mitigate and minimize the damage to the program. We've got 3,000 people working off-site in their bedrooms, studies, kitchen tables, doing assurance work. You know, we're continuing to hand over assets, like Custom House has just been handed over. We're in the middle of handing over these complex shafts and portals. Got a tiny bit of software integration to do to get the software right. So in a lot of ways, the monster that is Crossrail, this steamroller, has continued on, and we are targeting getting into trial running in this autumn and opening the railway in the summer of 2021 or earlier. You know, that's, if anything, COVID's kind of re-galvanized the teams, you know, to how urgently London needs this, because we've built big spacious trains, big new stations that are built for accommodating distancing principles. The challenges we have challenges though. At the minute, we have 1,000 people back on site. We had to unspool the whole organization, really site-based organization. It just wasn't safe to continue. We are now back to 1,000 people, and we're building up strongly up to 1,500 people, and that's down from 3,000 previously on site. So the effect on us is, can we really focus on the work that we need to do and rationalize it, and maybe defer some things, not so much stations or big things, but technical things could be delayed. That's all culminating in a revised plan that we're very close to having. We're about maybe 4 to 5 weeks away from a definitive plan. But at the minute, we're still targeting mid 2021 for opening this railway. But we're under pressure. You know, this has not been good news for us, but it hasn't knocked us off our bike, if you know what I mean. We kind of are continuing and progressing. The real challenge for us is we were right in the middle of the scenario testing. These are big tests of air velocity, pushing trains down in squadron formation, testing all the fire alarms. We've just finished this week the famous Bismarck tests. Don't know what the Bismarck test is, but we turn everything off and turn it all on again and make sure everything comes back. It's called the Bismarck test because of the famous unsinkable wartime ship. And it passed. So we are progressing our scenario testing.
You sound surprised at that, Mark.
No, it's just, so my surprise was no, I'm not surprised the asset came back because we spent a lot of money on resilience.
Yeah.
I was surprised how we managed to do 600 complex integrated tests with a very, very small number of people on site practicing social distancing principles. What this has brought out of Crossrail, and I'm sure everybody, is a spirit of creativity and what can be done. So that's the big picture. It's still aiming for mid-2021, trial running this calendar year, but we're under pressure. We're under the pump, but we're doing pretty well. But we know how important this is for the new West End and the whole of the city.
Before I pass over to Katherine, Mark, just quickly, what are the key indicators that we should be looking for, or perhaps that you're monitoring, that would indicate either or give you confidence in the summer 21 delivery, or indeed make you think that, I don't know, summer's becoming autumn, for example? What are the key things that you're looking to as in that process?
The real key is, can we commence trial running in this calendar year? Because the moment of trial running means that we're pretty much through the safety verification phase, and then we have a 6 to 9 month phase to build reliability to open the railway. So the day we start trial running, this project is metaphorically downhill, and the date starts to become in reach. And 3 or 4 months of trial running leads you to then 3 or 4 months of trial operations. And by the time we're in trial operations, we're naming the date to open. So the key milestone for everybody to look out for is, can we get into trial running? And there are 2 precursors to that. The software, Siemens Bombardier is in good shape. The software is well cooked, and we will have software ready in August and September to run this railway. The other side of the coin is much more challenging, which is the safety verification of the thousands, millions of assets that we've built. And we're working our best to try and prioritize the safety verification. So everybody should have eagle eyes on the start of trial running in this calendar year. And we'll kind of know that around August, September time. At the minute, this looks achievable if we keep the spirit of working hard. The problem with the safety verification is we can't take any shortcuts. The data has to be gathered, fire main data, PAV, all sorts of manner of safety systems have to be verified. But they're the milestones to look out for.
Great, thank you. We got a first sort of question coming in. I'll hold that. Hopefully I can find it again when I need to draw down on it. I'd just like to hand over to Katherine and give her an opportunity to reflect. Obviously, John Lewis, bellwether of the retail industry. Katherine, you, like other retail businesses, have been at the forefront of some of the challenges that we're all facing as a result of C19 and indeed sort of broader structural shifts that were coming through the retail market, amongst others. Would you be kind enough just to give the audience an update on your current thinking and plans for hopefully reopening from mid-June? Now we've got a little bit more colour from central government.
Sure. Hi. So I suppose the first thing to say is that from the John Lewis Partnership perspective, we've seen it from both angles. So we've seen it from the Waitrose perspective, where, we've had to adapt and continue trading throughout this period. And then obviously on the John Lewis department store side of things, unfortunately we had to close all of our shops. And I think as we come out of this period and we enter towards the 15th of June in terms of reopening, it's going to be a difficult time to trade, full stop, for everyone. I don't think we should underestimate that at all. In terms of the, and firstly, probably to say, actually, Mark and Stuart, everything you've said is hugely positive, which is great, and maybe I'll come back to that at the end. But in terms of giving you a flavour for what you can expect to see from the 15th of June, we've taken a lot of lessons learned from Waitrose, understanding how you can socially distance and trade effectively. And I think the first thing we'll always put at the utmost top priority is putting our customers and partner safety first. So we have a plan in place at the moment, but that can change at any moment, and it has done, to be honest, in the last couple of weeks as we've been waiting on the government guidelines. And we won't take any hesitation in changing it. But we will, on the 15th of June, our aspiration is to open a couple of pilot shops to understand how we can trade effectively. And then there will be a next batch of shops which we'll do a bit more test and learning, and then we'll have a wave of continued openings. In terms of what you can expect to see as you open a shop, we'll have restricted access and egress. So there'll be a single flow of customers coming in and navigating through the shop. We'll have deep cleans, both typically this has predominantly happened out of hours, but this will continue to happen throughout the day. We will have sneeze screens to protect partners at till points. Social distancing indicators will be in place, so you'll be able to, and I'm sure we've all experienced it as we've gone out to do some of our shopping in any event anyway.
Yes.
And there'll also be public announcements over tannoys to remind customers to be mindful of each other and also our partners as well. We will continue to limit some of the customer services interactions, so such as beauty consultants, changing rooms, etc. And that won't be dissimilar to other retailers either. In fact, I'm confident that a lot of the measures we're putting in place we'll see in other places as well. We'll restrict the openings of some facilities as well, such as cafes, until further notice, and we'll also be promoting a lot more cashless payment with limits up to £45. And then in addition to that, goods that are returned will be quarantined for about 72 hours before we then decide where it then goes through the supply chain. I think when it comes to Oxford Street specifically, and probably circling back to some of the comments Mark and Stuart have made, you know, Oxford Street and its cleanliness and the facilities we provide are now the time is more important than ever to really focus on it. I think pre-COVID, we struggled to socially distance on Oxford Street as it was. You add into the fact COVID and then Crossrail, you know, we've got quite a big challenge on our hands. And so it's really the time that we really need to put as much focus and effort onto really investing in Oxford Street and the surrounding areas and building on the good work that's already done, but really bringing it to the forefront and putting it into action, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katherine. Stuart, I mean, I think we've got 6 questions, which I'll start sort of using in a moment, but from Westminster's perspective, would you be happy just to give a little bit more colour, not street specific, but I think just in response to sort of Katherine's observations on essentially how we create a healthy, safe and welcoming environment for workers, visitors and shoppers, and indeed people that live in the area as they seek to move around the West End again, perhaps from mid-June onwards.
Yeah, I mean, our intention and part of what we will announce this afternoon will give some detail in terms of what we're intending in Oxford Street, but it will be about creating more pedestrian capacity. That will mean it will impact on traffic in Oxford Street. Part of us doing a launch of the vision, I think we're looking at how we can use the position that we're in at the moment to launch the vision in a way where maybe some of the longer term interventions we're looking at can be done on a short term basis as part of that. So I don't want to say too much about that and steal the leader's thunder in the event it comes to that. But in the short term, we're absolutely looking at how we create more capacity for pedestrians on Oxford Street. You know, lots of ongoing conversations with TfL, because clearly, I mean, you just think about Oxford Circus and the queues that are there at peak times, and how that's dealt with, the role of TfL in assisting with that, etc. So there are lots of those kinds of conversations going on as well about, you know, how we both the physical interventions, but also things like managing queues and stewarding and all of those things. Yeah. And then I do have to say this, and I'm sorry, it is a bit of a boring point, but it is a consideration. You know, there is a counter-terrorism element to this as well, and we're talking to the security services about that, because, you know, as we start creating queues again, you're back into a conversation about targets, etc. So all of those conversations are going on at the moment with the view to us having specific interventions in place from the beginning of June.
Great. And I think, I mean, looking at the, I'm just sort of gone into the chat piece. There are a number of questions around what are the specifics that we can expect to see. Now, I don't think, as much as some may want it, now's the specific moment, but I think, Stuart, from what you're saying, the announcements later on will provide a good degree of detail. And I think perhaps as an ongoing communication with wider interest, opportunity for Westminster to engage through the right means to provide that detail. And I know your team have been reviewing, I think you may have mentioned it, 500 requests for changes to the public realm as a result of welcoming ideas and observations from the wider community. But I think looking at the tone of the questions, there's definitely a desire for detail as ever. So that's something that perhaps you may care to reflect on. I was just going to pick up a couple of questions.
James,
yeah, go for it, Katherine.
James, sorry, could I come in there? Because I think also, I think obviously additional pedestrian capacity is hugely welcomed from a number of perspectives, but we just also need to be mindful about impact on deliveries and how, you know, that there is still a balance of being able to do the two together.
Yeah.
Okay, can I just come back on that as well, James? Because this was
a
really important point that I wanted to make earlier. One of the issues we have in terms of any intervention we make on Oxford Street is what happens to traffic as a result. And as I think a lot of people will be aware, that was one of the real issues with the previous scheme and traffic being pushed into residential areas. And this is not just an Oxford Street or Oxford Street district issue, it is a citywide issue, but the vast majority of traffic on our roads is delivery vehicles, it's servicing vehicles, it's commercial waste collection vehicles. And the only way we have a long-lasting impact here is if we reduce traffic full stop, not if we start shifting it around. If we just shift things around as a result of putting in place some temporary measures, we will go back to what we were before. And I don't think anybody wants that. So from the council's point of view, we absolutely want to see a reduction in traffic volumes in Westminster. But that requires us to work with all of you, obviously, because, you know, Katherine's point about servicing, etc. A lot of the traffic is being generated by business, and we need to work out something that's going to work for all of us that does result in that reduction of traffic. Otherwise, we will lose a really important opportunity here.
Yeah, and I think to that point, there's an opportunity for us to be radical in our approach to delivery consolidation, to waste management, and I think, Stuart, you and I have spoken about this, but there's a fantastic role for Westminster to help pull together all the individual organisation-led initiatives into one cohesive unit, and that would make a massive difference in terms of combining our efforts to achieve more together. I'm going to turn to some of the questions now. Stuart, you seem very popular, I'm afraid, for you, but I'll try and sort of come up with a nice blend for you, and some of these I'm sure we care to sort of reflect on afterwards. So I think there's a theme here in relation to a nature of uses on the street, Stuart, and this goes to I'm sure we'd all agree an observation that the past isn't the future in respect of retail dominance at ground floor level or basement, ground and first, etc. Would you give your views in relation to sort of flexibility on uses going forward as we see retail continue to evolve, and no doubt different uses being required on some of our, what historically would have been a street where retail would have been the predominant use?
Absolutely. As part of the city plan process, we did, you know, there is a specific section in there around Oxford Street and creating that flexibility, and the feedback we've certainly had is that that has been welcomed, and I'm not aware that it remains a particular problem. I'm obviously happy to discuss it if people do feel that there is a problem. I think the overarching principle from the council's point of view, and I appreciate there is something here about our officers understanding this as well. We are not the experts. What we need to do is give the flexibility for, as I've already said, when we talk about the future, the future will change. We need to make sure that whatever we have there is flexible enough to help all of you meet the challenges of the future and grab hold of the opportunities. So that is what we have tried to do through the city plan, is to be far less controlling and much more facilitating in terms of the types of use in Oxford Street.
Thank you. There's another question here just in relation to decision making on urgent planning and licensing requests, which, of course, we understand due process has to be followed, but in these untested times, is there perhaps more of a fast track process that it's possible for things to go through? Question for you, Stuart, please.
On planning, we are trying as far as possible to run some kind of normal service virtually in terms of committees and decision making, etc. I've not particularly had any requests around fast tracking planning applications. We have around licensing, and licensing we are considering our options at the moment, particularly around things like temporary licensing. And I don't mean temporary event notices, I mean temporary licenses being granted to support people in the short term. So we are currently working with our lawyers around what our options are from a licensing perspective. I have to just say, though, that we are also at the same time, and you'll understand this as our role as a local authority, but we are also under pressure from residents and actually the police around licensing, and particularly in relation to the hospitality industry opening up and what social distancing might look like in that environment and what role licensing plays. The police are very, very concerned about the West End from a licensing perspective. So we are working with everybody, including the police, around how we do this in a way that, as far as possible, works for everybody.
Yeah, and look, I think as someone who sort of sits on, if you like, both sides of the fence, I think using delegated authorities where appropriate, having much greater flexibility in relation to what would have predominantly had to be retail, but perhaps change of use to A3, etc. These are all things which, and indeed, perhaps considering extensions to planning consents not yet progressing. These are all things which have a big positive impact on the locality. Yeah. Mark, just turning to you for a moment, it feels, I think, to a number of the audience that when Crossrail was conceived, projected number of passengers and movements around the West End sat in one place. Clearly, projection is a projection, and some of the numbers that are used as to the net new flow as a result of additional capacity. How are you and your team, have you recalibrated your expectations for Crossrail? And what are the implications for that you may care to share, were that the case?
Good question. I mean, specifically on Crossrail, we're so close to the end. We're just going to get this job done now. There's almost nothing we can de-scope or take out, even if we wanted to. The trains are bought, the signalling's installed, the stations are built, the architectural finishes are almost done, the escalators are in. So we're going to push through. And if we take anything out of Crossrail, it'll be invisible to the travelling public. It'll be in the deep technology. It'll be a value judgment levies. So we're going to push to the end of Crossrail and get this over the line. If you look, and that's essential, because think of the tube at the moment. I was talking to the Commissioner this morning. The tube can only run about 15% capacity with social distancing principles. So London urgently needs a new east-west line with big trains, big stations. Luckily, we've just built Crossrail, which is good. And you think of the Jubilee and Central lines, they're going to be under a lot of stress getting the people to the Isle of Dogs and getting people to the West End. Yeah. For the future, so we're pressing on, and we think we are an essential national service to get this railway open as fast as possible. I saw a question earlier about will Bond Street open with it, and yes, we intend to open Bond Street with this railway. That's our plan, to open all the stations in one go.
Yeah.
If you look forward to transport planning, I mean, I don't know, and nobody would know. The transport planning is based on agglomeration of cities. You know, people who come and create economic benefit by agglomerating together, shopping, living, working together, collaborating together. I think it's far too early for people to say goodbye to mass transit systems. I know it's a knee-jerk reaction to say just because we can work from home now, the world's changed. I don't know. I think it'll take a while to settle down. I can't conceive, though, cities that don't have arteries and mass transit. I worked in Melbourne for many years, and in Melbourne and Sydney, they are intensifying their capital infrastructure. There's no talk there about detuning it. So I think the story on cost-benefit things isn't written yet, and it's far too early to talk about it. But we just got to get the Elizabeth line open for another artery.
Yeah, agreed. And it does feel that anything that we can do to ease the burden on the road network is beneficial to us all, because that points to the nature of the environment we create, impact on air quality, and creating that environment where people want to return to. Katherine, just thinking sort of slightly longer term from a JLP perspective, clearly we've got some very near-term challenges as to how you operate your retail network across the UK. Are John Lewis also thinking, I'm sure they are, but perhaps slightly longer term strategically as to what your thinking is for the future of retail? Just interested to get any readout there as to current themes that the team are thinking about as they both look at your existing store network and also the future.
Yeah. Well, it's regardless of COVID-19, I suppose we're continually looking at how we can evolve our retail proposition and also our property proposition as well. So I think it's ongoing review, essentially, always looking at new initiatives and ideas. I think I've seen one of the questions actually that's come up as what is one of the biggest lessons learned about COVID so far. And I think some of it has been actually around how much of us have been able to adapt in working from home. I think that's been a huge surprise to everyone. And not only that, about how we've adapted our services. So we put some of our fashion services online, got a huge take up, and it's been great to see how we've been able to adapt with partners in their own homes, but also there's been an active take up of those services as well. So I think somebody said it earlier as well. I think out of these crises, there always comes opportunities. And I think we've got to try and identify what are those opportunities. I think undoubtedly there's going to be, and we've already seen it, a number of casualties in the retail sector. And I think we're only on the cusp of that. But out of it will come a huge amount of creativity. And I think we've got to collectively work with our councils and local boroughs to work out how can we reimagine our towns and cities, and what will it look like going forward. And I think there's loads of opportunities within that scope on a variety of scales.
And I think that's very neatly leads me into a question which I'd like to sort of pose of all of my panelists. So this is I think a pretty decent question, not that they're all obviously very good. But the question reads, how do you reconfigure the West End, Oxford Street to attract visitors when global travel restrictions are still in place and when many cultural institutions remain closed? So Katherine, you touch on working with local authorities to transform areas. What are the things that you're thinking of when you say that?
I suppose in the long term, it's thinking about the uses that are going to attract people. But I think in the immediate term, and it's some of the things we've already touched on, it's thinking about how can we create an environment that's going to make people feel confident, safe, and able to come back to the West End. So I've seen a couple of questions pop up around how do we kickstart the West End again? And I think it's going to be about some of the things that Stuart touched on in terms of creating space effectively for pedestrians to feel like they've got the space and the confidence to navigate around. And I think it's all going to come back to what's been on the agenda for a long time, which is placemaking and looking at the environment. I think longer term, obviously, as I started off, I think there is a review about what type of uses going forward is really going to generate and stimulate people back into the West End. And it's not going to be what it was before. It's not going to be solely retail. We've got to think much broader and wider than that in terms of the uses that we offer, which is why the planning piece is so important and creating that level of flexibility.
Yeah, and indeed who our audience is. Because I think we'd all have to agree that's going to change dramatically too. Stuart, would you care to respond to that question? Or any observations from Katherine?
I mean, I agree with everything Katherine's just said. Confidence and people feeling safe, massively important, and that's what we're all working to in the short term. I think public transport is a really key element of this that I'm worried about. I don't think there is an immediate solution at the moment as to how tubes and buses are going to operate. I think TfL are pretty overwhelmed alongside all of the financial challenges that they're facing. So the whole issue of public transport and how that works in the short term. And I also think that there is a conversation that needs to be had that is being missed a little bit at the moment, which is not just about the immediate stuff that we're doing, but actually, and James, I've mentioned this to you before, you know, it's things like office occupation in Westminster, because those people who work in Westminster will be using F&B. They'll be, you know, buying things in retail outlets. And there is what I'm seeing and hearing at the moment is a lot of movement, not just from Westminster, but from central London to the outer London boroughs, which are seen as cheaper, less space needed, etc. And so there is a conversation that we need to have, because there's a real danger, I think, if we don't have this conversation about what that actually means for Westminster and for central London. It's not just about those international visitors, actually, it's about all of the 750,000 people who work in Westminster or did pre-coronavirus every day. What's going to happen to them post-coronavirus, and what are our options there?
Yeah, and agreed. And Mark, quick question for you, and we've got a couple of minutes left, but how well coordinated do you feel across different modes of transport? So tube network, buses, is there a close link with Crossrail in that space?
Yeah, I mean, before doing this job, I ran the tube, and I've got to say, my colleagues in TfL have done an amazing job to keep the level of service they've got by being affected with their own people. I think in the transport family, 42 people have passed away with the virus, and they've had it tough, and the financial things are quite dramatic. So I think they're a very capable organisation who's done well. From a Crossrail point of view, we're entirely synced up, and I'll just repeat what I said. When this opens, Elizabeth line, we will be really grateful. We've produced a brand new tube line with big spacious trains, air conditioned, big new facilities. I think people will look at the Elizabeth line and say, wow, that's been impressive and a real bonus to the city. West End and at the other end as well, you know.
Okay, I'm sure you're right, Mark. I'm sure you're right. And there mounts the case for Crossrail too, eh?
Definitely. One day.
Okay, well, look, we were scheduled to finish at 1:45. I know we haven't answered all the questions, but I'm sure that's something that our able teams at WPA NWEC will take away and can respond to with the help of my fellow panelists. But on behalf of New West End Company WPA, I'd like to thank Katherine, Stuart and Mark for the session today. It's much appreciated. And I hope our audience have benefited from your insights. So on behalf of us all, thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Cheers.